Now we're going to use our imaginations a little bit when we get started. Let's pretend you're a young man and you're dating and you have a girlfriend and you get a letter from her. You open it up real quick and you see an underlined sentence. I'll love you always. And boy, that is just what you have been wanting to hear. Because this girl's really special. She's your sweet thing. So you read that and you're so elated. But then you read the rest of the letter. Dear darling, I think we need more space, if you know what I mean. I'll love you always, but I want to see other people. Goodbye for now, sweet thing. Well, the operative word there is goodbye for now. And he is about to be a page in her scrapbook. You see, the important thing here is you have to read the beginning of the letter, the middle of the letter, and the end of the letter. My presentation, Paul and Women Teachers. Did Paul restrict the role of Christian women in the New Testament church? This particular scripture that we're going to be talking about has affected millions of women through hundreds of years, and it's still affecting modern women today in many churches. It's the scripture you've all heard about women not teaching or usurping authority over a man. But today we're going to read not just the sentence pulled out of the middle. We are going to read what comes before it. We're going to read what comes after it, and also try to understand what was going on at the time. We're a little bit handicapped because we're living 1900 years later in a totally different culture. It's very hard for us to understand their culture. It is so different from our own. Another thing that handicaps us is we do not have the message that Paul received that he was responding to. Someone brought him a message of what was going on in this church, and he's writing back his answer to their problems. And we don't have the letter that he's answering. It's a little bit like being on a telephone conversation or in the room with someone who's on a telephone conversation, and you can't hear what's going on the other line. And they say this or that, and you're trying to fill in the gaps, but you really don't know what the other person is saying. You've only got one half of the conversation. So we need to realize that we are at somewhat of a loss because of that, and we've got to read very carefully because of that. Now, this is the beginning of 1 Timothy, the beginning of the letter. You'll notice Paul is calling himself an apostle. He's writing it to Timothy. And we notice that Paul has gone on into Macedonia, and he's told Timothy to stay behind in the city of Ephesus. So the church that's having the problems is in the city of Ephesus. And the problem comes up in that same sentence, so that you may command certain ones. The Greek word there is tizon, and that means ones. The word for man is not there. Some of the translation insert the word man there that they're talking about, but they're really not. Certain ones not to teach false doctrines any longer, or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. So we've got some clues here. So we're going to gather up these clues and try to figure out more about what's going on. You see, too, that these promote controversies rather than God's word. So there's some controversies going on in the city of Ephesus. So I'd like to point out things that I learned when I was studying about Ephesus. There were really surprising things, very surprising things. For example, they believed, rightly or wrongly, that their city was founded by Amazon women. Now, the Amazons were some tough women. They were warrior women. And this particular woman, this is a sculpture, and originally there was a bow that comes between her arms. These were warrior women, and there's quite a bit of writing about them. It is said that these women could not mate or without a mate. I don't say marriage because they didn't really have marriages like we think of marriage today, but they could not have children, shall we say, the right to have a family unless they had killed a man first. Now, these were some pretty mean women, and they weren't above going on a raid in the nearby villages, grabbing a few of the best-looking men, and, you know, staying together long enough to be sure that there was going to be a baby, and then killing the men, or returning them to their village if the men were lucky. So these were incredibly wicked women. This not someone that you'd want as your girlfriend for sure. So they were actually written about by the Greek historians of the day. So you will find in Greek histories of the day that Ephesus was founded by Amazon women. It's not something I'm just making up. But that was a surprise to me. Now, these women were called, in the histories of the day, they were called killers of men. Just like I've told you, it was a pretty common thing. And sometimes they would enslave men when they captured them in battle, keep them as slaves, make them do the weaving, make them do the cooking, while they went out and rode the horses, and they were excellent horsewomen and practiced with their bow and arrow, and they were quite deadly shots with their bow and arrow. There was a number of names I ran across. It was so interesting. This was supposedly historical names of women who had really lived. And one of them was called Death Song. Death Song. How would you like to be engaged to Death Song? Oh, sounds scary enough. Now, in this next one, that is from a Greek vase, and it is showing Achilles, who is fighting with an Amazon queen. Now, there's two different legends about this. In the Greek legend, he kills her, the Battle of Troy. But in the Amazon legend, she kills him. And it's a longer story than that. It's a very interesting story, but we don't know the truth, which myth is true, because they both died in the Battle of Troy. So my theory is they killed each other. But anyway, we don't know for sure. But we find myth after myth after myth that survive to this day about the Amazons. So when Paul is talking about them devoting themselves to myths, it makes sense once you understand what was going on in Ephesus. These people really believed they were descended from Amazon women. And evidently some of them had the genealogies to prove it. Although it doesn't sound as if Paul himself believed it. I don't know. It doesn't matter to us whether it's true or not. The point that they believed it showed that it would influence their church and it would influence their lives. Now here we have 1 Timothy 4:7. That's the same book we're talking about, and Paul is saying have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. So he is linking up these myths and tales to the women, which is very interesting. They were talking about some women here that he's linking these tales to. I'd like to show you where Ephesus is, because for us, that's kind of a mystery place. Where was Ephesus? It was actually a part of Asia, and you see there is Ephesus, and we read about Ephesus in Acts 19:20. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So the goddess that the Amazons set up was called Artemis. And Paul almost got himself killed in the 2-hour riot that happened in the Colosseum there. Finally, the city clerk quieted the crowd and said, "Men of Ephesus, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and her image which fell down from heaven?" All right, so that tells us a lot about the city of Ephesus, doesn't it? It tells us that they thought they were the guardian of a great goddess and that her image had actually fallen down from heaven. So they viewed themselves as a very important city. They were the 4th largest city of their day. The Colosseum, where the 2-hour riot happened, that's the top picture here. It would hold 25,000 people. And today, the acoustics remain so good. I have talked to people who have been in that Colosseum, and if you go down there and speak in a lower voice even than I'm speaking in, that up on the upper balcony, they can hear you perfectly. So it's very interesting, the things that they knew. Now, the lower picture is of the library. Now, the library had a secret tunnel over to the Temple of Artemis. you might not know why. When I tell you about the Temple of Artemis, you'll go, oh, okay, all right, as to why that was, that they would want a passageway between the two. Here we have some more of the ruins of Ephesus. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. They were a tremendous slave trading city, and it was a very wealthy city. People came from all over the world to go to the Temple of Artemis. They brought a lot of wealth in, and the lower picture is the Arch of Severus, and it was a famous landmark the world over. Now, the temple that was in Ephesus, the Temple of Artemis, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It took 120 years to build. There were 127 columns, 60 feet high, and it was 20 feet longer than a football field. This was a big temple. If you notice the sculptures at the bottom of the columns, those were all life-size sculptures done by some of the most famous artists of the day and really of all time. There was a lot of little rooms inside the Temple of Artemis. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. And there was a lot of sculptures of her. Now, this was one of them that was actually in that temple, the real sculpture, a real photograph of it. Can you guess what kind of a goddess she was? Those are rows of breasts. So she was a fertility goddess, and in those days a woman needed to have lots of children, or she had absolutely no prestige, and she might lose her husband to another, something like that. It was a very rigid society. Now, those were little babies down there. Artemis meant safe. It meant safe, because if you prayed to Artemis, then you would come safely through childbirth. That was the idea. And so her name meant safe. And it was a very, very popular religion. People came, as I say, around the world there. But what brought them in? Okay, we could see how the women would want to ask for children. What brought them in? Well, there were young women who began as virgins who would go and work in the temple, and they represented the goddess. They were known as Melissae, which meant bees. The men would come in to worship the goddess, bring their offering, their money offering or whatever offering, and then they would be sent to one of the little rooms, and one of the young women would come out all very elaborately dressed, and she represented the goddess. And there was an entire indoctrination that was a part of this religion. And the indoctrination went that the man would be joined to the goddess in sex. So it was actually a form of temple prostitution, only they did not see it as prostitution. This was holy. This was sacred. This was a joining with the goddess herself. And the goddess then empowered the man and also gave him secret knowledge. And we'll get to that. You notice this is a coin. This is a real coin of Ephesus. And the bee was advertising these bee goddesses, the numerous bees that served at the Temple of Artemis. And if they became pregnant, then they had ways, even back then, of aborting the babies, and they did not bear these children. You know, it was like offered up as a sacrifice to Artemis. Very, very sad. The bottom picture has to do with a myth. Artemis was taking a bath, the tale goes. A hunter peeked through the bushes and was watching her bathe. She looked up and saw him and was so angry that she turned him into a stag. Well, then the hunter had hunting dogs with him, and his own hunting dogs chased him until they killed him. So he was killed by his own dogs, and that is that myth. So now you know one of the myths of the city of Ephesus. Paul had a lot of sinners in his congregation. He had a lot of unconverted people. You can find this out as you start studying still in the first chapter. He's talking in verse 7 about people who want to be teachers of the law, but they don't know what they're talking about. So evidently there's more than one kind of false teaching going on. It goes down to verse 10, and he starts talking about adulterers and perverts. Now, I've just told y'all about some pretty fancy forms of adultery, right, where you feel real righteous afterwards. So that was going on, and Paul was calling it adultery. He was telling them what it really was, and perversion. He talks about slave traders. Remember, I told you they were one of the top slave trading cities in the ancient world, liars, perjurers. So he is turning all of these people to Christ. And he says, I was once a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent man. I was shown mercy because I acted in ignorance and misbelief. So he's holding up his own past, saying, look, if there's hope for me, there's hope for anybody. So, and he explains the solution. He's turning them to Jesus Christ. Verses 14 through 16, we're talking about Jesus Christ showing mercy. So he's explaining the solution to their problems with sin. Now, in this next passage, toward the end of the first chapter, he's giving Timothy some real good advice, and he's warning him. So he says, hold on to faith and a good conscience. Can you imagine how worried you would be if you were the overseer of a young man like Timothy, unmarried, in a city like Ephesus? It's like, hold on to your morals, Don't be influenced by that stuff. Paul, I'm sure, had spent some sleepless nights worrying about Timothy in a city like that. Now, he talks about two people who have shipwrecked their faith in verse 20. Hymenaeus is a word that means wedding song. Now, if you can think of a guy who would come around and say, hi, I'm wedding song, I kind of doubt it. I think that was a woman's name. Hi, I'm wedding song. No? So the other person, Alexander, there's not a whole lot of question about what he was. Now, if we look in 2 Timothy 2, 16 through 18, Hymenaeus' wedding song is mentioned again. This time she's teamed up with someone named Philetus, which is beloved. So was this a man and a woman? Was this two women? We don't know for sure, but we know that they were preaching that the resurrection had already taken place. All right, so these were false teachers. We know from the Word of God that he's naming specific false teachers that were spreading false doctrine in the city of Ephesus. And he's warning Timothy, look out for those two. First of all, he's warning him about Alexander and Hymenaeus, and then Hymenaeus teams up with Philetus. So she's evidently a pretty persistent lady here. Now, one thing I need to tell you about, in the Greek language, you need to remember that there's only one word, the word woman. They do not have a special word for wife. So a man's basically saying, this is my woman. See, so it's pretty confusing. If you look at Colossians 13:19, husbands, love your wives, it's the exact same word as 1 Timothy 2:9, I want women to dress modestly. See, so we don't know if he's talking about some unconverted wives or if he's talking about, church women themselves. I will tell you a little bit about this modesty thing. In Ephesus, they just didn't have any of it. They had public baths where the males and the females bathed together totally with no clothes. That's bad enough. But they also had public bathrooms where there was enclosure around it, and both the males and the females relieved themselves in the same enclosure. So there was no modesty in the city of Ephesus. And so Paul is talking here about dressing modestly. So I don't know if we're talking about low-cut dresses. I don't know if it's transparent fabrics, whatever. But there's some pretty immodest dressing going on in the city of Ephesus. Another thing that we need to understand is some of the Greek philosophy that was common in Ephesus among the Gnostics. They taught that Eve was created first. Now, they said that afterwards God deceived Adam and told him he was created first, but it was really Eve, one of their major teachings. They believed that Eve received special knowledge when she ate the forbidden fruit. And of course, part of that's true. She received the knowledge of good and evil. But this was good knowledge. This was good knowledge, and that female teachers later passed on this special good knowledge that Eve had received down to men. Now, these women teachers are mediators, would mediate between the gods and mankind, and pass on and empower with this knowledge. And we find out that sex was involved in this, because remember, the biblical term for Adam knew his wife Eve, to know. All right, to know is a very ancient phrase, and it comes from this idea of empowering through sex. So it's really, a pagan tie-in that got tied in there. So these mediators had hidden knowledge, and they were often or usually available for sexual services after class. I gave this at a Methodist church one, and one guy says, "Boy, that class would be an interesting one," or something like that. He got a laugh out of it. I was like, okay, well. All right, so remember those things. They're important for us to know. I'm not telling you everything about their society, obviously, just the things that you need to know to understand these first 3 chapters, the things that tie in. 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 2, and we've got, I urge you then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. You remember that riot I was telling you about, where Paul almost got killed and they were yelling, "Great is Artemis," for 2 hours? He was wanting some peace. He was wanting peaceful lives. All right, now I'd like to point out there that word peaceful there is important. So, take a look at that and remember it. I'm going to tie it in with some other things in a little while here. But what he wanted was some peace. He didn't want riots. There's 3 Greek words for authority. Now, I have them down there, and I have listed their Strong's numbers. I'll tell you what a Strong's number is. Greek is a very complicated language. If you have a word in the subject of the sentence, then it's spelled one way. If it's an object of a preposition, it's spelled another way. If it's masculine, it's spelled one way. If it's female, it's spelled another way. It's very complicated language. It's how the phrase, "It's all Greek to me." That's how that got started. Because of that, they assigned Strong's numbers, so that the male version of a word and the female version normally has the same Strong's number. And the variations between, as far as where it's placed in the sentence, it still has the same Strong's number. That way you can keep up with if you're still dealing with the same word. Because if the ending's different, is that a different word or is that the same word? And so that's how the translators and people who research Greek keep up with the complexities of the Greek language. So, all right, we've got 3 words for authority here. I'm not going to try and pronounce each one of them, but we see that the very first one in 1 Timothy 2:2, they're using the first one, 5247. Hooper, Ohey, how is that? Anyway, that means those in authority. And of these 3, the thing that you need to know is that none of these 3 words for authority appear in our verse that causes the most problem. When it says to usurp authority, it's not any of these 3 Greek words for authority, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so it's none of the 3. So let's go on here. Paul is again turning his people toward God. We've talked about the word peaceful there. That is the male form of the word, and it's numbered 2272. Can someone remember the 2272 for us? Okay, Rhonda's going to remember 2272. Remember that. So we get on down, and we find he wants all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Definitely true. Now look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5. There is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ. Remember what I told you about mediators? Remember where they were teaching that a woman had to come between the gods and man? See, he's knocking that whole concept down here. There's one mediator, and that's Jesus Christ. You see? So we're understanding that part now, that it has to do with the Gnostic beliefs that these women were mediators, and you had to go through them to get to God. Paul starts getting specific here about what's going on, and he's mentioning that he's an apostle, It's got the authority to handle this problem that's going on. I'm telling the truth. I'm not lying. And a teacher of the true faith. And he says, I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands in prayer without anger or disputing. All right, that tells us there was some anger and disputing, doesn't it? So he wouldn't say that if everything was peaceful. So we've got a situation where the men have gotten really angry, really upset, and he wants them praying instead of the way they've been. He scolded the men, now he turns to the women. And I want women, or that word could be wives, we've only got one word there, we don't have the word wife to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship God. Did you catch that? If I say to you, Jeanette professes to worship God. Do you catch that? See, there's a question there as to whether they really do worship God. You see, in Paul's mind, these women who are wearing the low-cut dresses or the transparent linen or whatever it was they were wearing, he wasn't too sure they were there to worship God. You know, he wasn't too sure at all. Profess to worship God. Yeah, sure. Those women are here to worship God. Now we get to our famous sentence, and we're going to look at it. Now there's an I that's in the Greek that doesn't get translated. Isn't that interesting? He's saying, I let the woman learn. You know, if you put that in there, it sounds a little bit more like what his practice is, doesn't it? They leave that out and say, let the woman. You see how that turns it into a command there instead of I let the woman? In a minute, I'm going to show you in the Greek where that I is there. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor, now, to usurp authority over thee. All that is translated from one word. The one word is authenten. Authenten. The word thee is not there. Now, the Greeks have 16 different words for thee. They have a male version of thee. They have a female version of thee. They have a neuter version of thee. And they have all, 16 versions, and it's not here. The Greeks are very, very free with the word thee, but it's not here. Now, the ending of this Greek word, the ein, that tells us that we're dealing with a to form of a verb. If I say to run, that's the to form of the verb. You understand? Now, if I say runner, that is the noun form. See, we've made run into a noun. Okay, y'all got me on that. So to make it a little trickier, this word is used only once in the entire New Testament, which is, most words, there's several verses, and we can go to this verse and figure out, oh, okay, I understand it better after reading that verse. It's only mentioned once. Now, there was a man who was a grammar teacher who defined this word, authenten, in the year 180. So we're pretty close to the time here of Paul. And let's see, I'll make a stab at pronouncing his name, Phoenicus. And he described it to thrust out from oneself. Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone too bad, but we're talking about the anatomy here. We're not talking about female anatomy, okay? And it also is tied in with the concept of to desire. So something is being thrust out from oneself while desiring. So we're definitely talking about a sexy word here, folks. We really are, and that guy's definition, once you understand what he's saying, is a pretty sexy definition. Now, there was a man named Maurice in the 2nd century, and he was a teacher. And he wrote down, do not use the word authenten, students. It's too coarse. So it was a coarse word that he told them not to mess with. Don't use that word. Now, we have a man named John Chrysostom, and he lived from 347 to 407. Now, he defined the word as sexual license. Okay, sexual license basically means sexual immorality. This is what he's saying it was. But now the next one is the one that really gets us here. Clement of Alexandria in the year 215. There were some women who were involved in Christian groups who were coming up with the same sort of teaching, empowering through sex. All right? So they were having sexual orgies in their love feasts. So can you imagine anything more disgusting to God? Now the verb is being turned into a noun, just like run and runner, and to run and runner. And they're calling these women authentia. It's the same word. It has the same Strong's number, you see. It's just now used as a noun. So these women who were being involved in sexual orgies were tying in the concept of empowering through sex or passing on knowledge from Eve and sex. Now I want to show you the Greek words of this whole passage. Now it starts out, gune. It can mean wife or woman. You can read it either way. Now, when we get to the word that's translated silence, what was the number, Rhonda? 27. Very good. Guess what? This is the female version of that same word. When it's a female version, it's translated silence. When it's the male version, it's translated peaceful. But yet, they're both in the same chapter. And they're written by the same author, Paul. So how can we have the same word in the same sentence, male and female version? And guess what they did? To hide what they had done, they put a new Strong's number on the female version. In other Greek words, both the female version of the word and the male version of the word have the same Strong's number. But here they gave them two different Strong's numbers. The male one was defined as peaceful. The female one was defined as silence. I started finding out some interesting stuff about this point. See this little funny thing at the top here, that little W? It looks like a W that collapsed in. When that comes at the end of a verb, it means the word I is there, the word I. Now, there's another way in Greek to add I. There's a word you can add, but if you add it at the end of a verb like that, you're saying, I do this. I run, I walk, or whatever when you put that at the end. So this is I let learn, and that is never translated. I haven't seen a translation yet that translates that I that is there. And in my paper, Paul and Women Teachers, I've got a reference to that, and where you can go and find out, that I ought to be there. With all obedience, didascan, EIN ending. Okay, we already know, right? That's a to form of the verb. See the EIN and didascan, to teach. It's the exact same word when Jesus told us to go out and disciple and to teach. It's the same word. Same word is right here. But a woman, I'm not allowing, nor, and there's the authentic. Now, I put down sexually seduced. It's not quite the same. We frankly don't have an English word that's identical. We just don't. I mean, our F word doesn't quite mean the same thing. They had it to the point of where, like, this was on a level with holiness or something, you see. It was empowering. It was giving knowledge from Eve. It was mediators. So it's a whole different culture, like I say. So we don't have, to sexually seduce is close, but it's not like a dating situation where it's sexual seduction. It is a temple situation, and it's linked with worship. It's linked with women who were mediators. So in saying this, in writing this, what was Paul's motives? First of all, he started out, y'all remember where he was warning Paul? And he said, stay there in Ephesus so you may command certain ones not to teach false doctrines anymore. So he's warning Timothy about these false teachers. So that was one of his motives, was to stop these false teachers. He wanted to stop them teaching the myths. Remember the myths I've told you about the Amazon women? There's more of them, folks. I could keep you here for a long time telling you all these myths. Anyway, and the other thing was they wanted to stop teachers such as wedding song Hymenaeus, she's mentioned by name, from teaching blasphemy. And we know for sure that she was. She's mentioned by name as a false teacher. And the other thing was to prevent, now these could have been unconverted wives, they could have been women coming who maybe, we don't know for sure whether they had husbands or not, but Paul didn't think they were there to worship God. He had some serious doubts about it. The doctrines of Artemis and also the Gnostic philosophy is interlaced in this whole passage. I haven't even got to all of it yet. The other thing was he was wanting to prevent these women from teaching their own particular form of sexual seduction as worship. And this was a very popular religion. Are y'all surprised? Now look at the next verse that follows that one. So we've got 1 Timothy 2:13. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. So why is he saying that? He is counteracting the teaching that Eve was formed first. See? No. Adam was formed first. Get it straight. And then Eve was formed first. There was none of this, deceiving Adam that he was first. And Adam was not the one deceived. Now you see, they had taught that Adam was deceived by God into thinking that he was created first. Paul's saying, no. Adam was not deceived. Eve was deceived and became a sinner. Now he's saying here that Eve did not have special knowledge from eating that fruit. See, it's all tying together. It's interlocking. It's interweaving. Now this particular Greek phrase, but women will be saved. Now where they translated it saved, it's from an obsolete Greek word that means safe. What did Artemis mean? What did it mean? You remember? All right. It meant safe. So Paul is saying that women will be safe throughout the childbearing if they, and he's talking about the husband and the wife, continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Now the Phillips Bible is not always an accurate Bible, but they did get it right on this verse, and it says women will come safely through childbirth. So the Greek word there is actually safe and not saved. So there's more about this in Paul and Women Teachers. Now, there's a lot of ways that we understand that Paul did not mean that all women were not to teach. Here in Titus 2:2-3, he's talking about that aged men be temperate, grave, sober-minded, sound in faith, in love, and patience. The aged women, and actually that could be translated elder women too. The phrase there could be elder. So that opens up a whole new possibility for that particular phrase. Anyway, the elder women likewise be reverent in demeanor, not slanderers, nor enslaved to much wine, teachers of that which is good. Actually, where it's translated teachers of what is good, the Greek phrase is right down at the bottom, and it means a teacher of the right. It has to do with the right way of life. When you change it, a teacher of the good, it could be good recipes, good advice. But when you start saying a teacher of the right, then you're talking about a teacher of the right way. So Paul himself is telling older women to be teachers of the right way of life. Now, as we go on into Timothy 3, that third chapter, remember, this is all the same letter. This stuff all ties together. Now, Timothy is having trouble with a lot of false teachers doing a lot of different stuff. There's a lot going on. And so his idea is to set up some leadership. So Timothy won't be by himself. Let's get some leadership going here to back up Timothy with the evil things that are going on in the Ephesus congregation. Here's another little quirk here. When we get to verse 8, it's translated as deacons. Now, the Strong's number is 1249. In other places, that's translated as ministers. So this really should read, likewise, ministers must be reverent, not double-tongued or given to much wine or greedy for money. Now, why in the world did they translate it deacons here when the word diakonos means minister? And is the same word in 2 Corinthians 3:6, who made us sufficient as ministers, diakonos, 1249, same word of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. All right, so the same word, exactly the same Greek spelling, is translated minister in 2 Corinthians 3:6. And not just there, but a lot of other places too. It's translated as minister. So in this passage, he's talking about setting up ministers who will restore some order to this messed up congregation. Now, in the next verse, all right, the King James adds a few words here. Adds the word there. It's not in the Greek. I checked it out. I've got some excellent software so I can go back and see what's in the Greek. It says their wives. Remember the word for woman and wife? You can't tell for sure, but there isn't there. But they have a word for there, but it's not here. Is that confusing? Anyway, all right. So he's saying women in like manner, and then this little part means that that's added in translation. So women in like manner, grave, not slanderers, temperate, faithful in all things. And then there's another version. Women, likewise, dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate, faithful in all things. Now, I quoted you several translations there to show you the King James is wrong when it says their wives. They were trying to get away from the concept of these these leaders, these ministers, 1249 diakonos, that were women. So he's given qualifications for the men, and then he gives qualifications for the women, right side by side. Now, he's giving the same qualifications for both. He is saying that the men must have dignity. The women must be dignified. The men must be not double-tongued. The women must not be gossips. The men must not be addicted to wine. The women must be temperate. See, he's saying the same thing, with just slightly different words. The men must be not greedy for money. Now, it may be that the women didn't have much of that to get their hands on. So he doesn't use the exact same things. He says they must be faithful. So, must be faithful. But we're dealing with dual requirements. And here's another place. This is also in chapter 3. 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 2. Here is a trustworthy saying. If anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task. The he there is from a third person, a verb, like I, you, he, and it could be he or she. So there's not necessarily a sex indicated with that he. And if you've got both males and females, you refer to in the Greek anyway, in like a he. But anyway, that you can't tell the he isn't there. It's really from a verb. The anyone is taken from the word tis, T-I-S. And that really does mean anyone. Now, the King James right in there says, if any man sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task. But the word man isn't there. It's not there. Now, the overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. I've heard people say, all right, that lets out the women because they can't have a wife. But wait a minute, did Paul have a wife? Did Timothy have a wife? Weren't they ministers? So the real understanding of this particular verse is that there was a lot of priests who were being called into the ministry. And some of them, like Gamaliel, who was Paul's teacher, had as many as 4 or 5 wives. And he is stating here the policy that ministers must have only one wife, may not have multiple wives. It didn't affect the women, because guess what? They only had one husband. They weren't allowed to have more than one husband, right? So it didn't affect them, has nothing to do with them. He's telling people like Gamaliel that you're going to have to put away some of your wives and have just one. Temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, easy to teach. Now, the next concept I want to talk about with y'all is the concept of spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. Now, to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. So it goes on and lists these different spiritual gifts, but he's saying to each person. He's not saying to each male. He's saying to each person, men and women, that we're given a very precious spiritual gift. It can be anything from gifts of healing, faith, miraculous powers. That's a dandy one, isn't it? What's happening now is like the women of the church are given these beautiful gifts by God. And they're just all wrapped up and they're gorgeous and they're supposed to be for the whole church to use and benefit from. But they say, oh no, wait a minute, you're a woman. You can't open your gift. Don't open it, you're a woman. And no, you're a woman too, don't open your gift. You men, yeah, open your gifts, men. But the women aren't allowed to open their gifts in a lot of the churches today. We've all got different gifts, whether they're big flashy gifts, whether they're little but very needed gifts. We are all needed together, and everyone is needed, and everyone's gift is needed. All these are the work of the one and the same Spirit, and he gives them to each one as he desires. Now, it's the way God desires it. It's not the way man desires it. And it's God's decision whether he gives a certain gift to this person or to that person, to a man or to a woman. But a woman can receive a large spiritual gift if God decides to give it to that woman. It's totally up to him. And whether another person thinks that person has the gift or not, it's God's doing, and it's up to God as to what has happened. And we must allow everyone to open their gift, to discover what it is, to develop it, to use it for the good of the entire church. For too long, we've been sitting with our beautiful gifts that we haven't been able to open. It's time to rip off that wrapping paper and find out what they are. But yet, this is a scary concept, too. It's a little frightening. I know as I started to understand this and everything, sometimes it does seem a little frightening. If you've been always kind of in a safe spot, watching, observing, not being really responsible. Through many, many years in the church, I've been in the church longer than I want to admit, so many times we'd be doing Bible studies and I really want to understand the scripture, but I'm not going to memorize where it is because I don't need to. I'm a woman. I did that. So now I'm having to learn what they all are and back up on that. But so it's a little scary when someone says to you, you may have a really big gift and you may have to really do something. This scripture right here is very, very good. And it shows us that we rely on God the Father and Jesus Christ to give us the strength to do our gift, whatever it is. And he empowers us. He gives us the strength. He gives us the power to do it. Each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, he should do it as if one speaking the very words of God. If anyone serves, he should do it with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. So, ladies, don't be afraid to use your gift. You don't have to use it or to find out, to start praying and asking what it is, or maybe several gifts, because God will help you and empower you and make you strong enough to do whatever it is.